to give this presentation. I see some names. I see somebody that I knew back in high school, and I see somebody from several companies ago. Hello, Susan. Hello, Mike, and thank you, and everybody. This talk came out of a book. It was kind of, I guess, really, let me make sure I'm sharing. Am I sharing my screen, Robert? Just want to make sure that you all can see it. Okay, well, I'll assume you can see the screen then.
No, not yet, David.
Not yet? Okay, so hold on. Hold on, here we go. I'm gonna share the
We did practice
PowerPoint.
this, everyone. Oh, there we go, okay.
There we go. So we can see that now. Excellent, okay. This show came out of a passion that my father and I both had for presidential landmarks. I grew up in New York, and I'll be honest with you, I have lost track of how many times I went to Sagamore Hill. Hold on a second, I have to restart this. Hold on a second, folks. I'm sorry. I only have a degree in engineering. Why should I be able to do this? I'm going to try this one more time using this method, and let's see if this will work now. So you should be able to, okay, now, Robert, now I can't see my notes. We had practiced this, didn't we? There we go, I got it now. Okay, can everybody see it?
I'll edit this part out, David. Continue.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
So again, this talk came out of an interest and a passion project that my dad and I ended up writing this book, Presidential Landmarks, which came out, oh golly, it's almost 30 years ago now. And out of it, I decided it would be fun to look not at all 45 presidents, but the ones who were born here in New England. So we'll start with the very first president who was born here in New England, and that would, of course, be John Adams. This home on Franklin Street was the birthplace of John Adams. It was built in 1681 by his father, Deacon Adams. Here, John was born on October 30th of 1730. Now, his dad wanted him to be a minister, but like most children, he decided to carve his own path, and he went to Harvard and took up the law. They moved to this bigger home next to the birthplace in 1764 when he married a young woman named Abigail, and it was a bigger home, more room for his law office, and his new son, John Quincy, who was born in 1767. This is the home where Adams drafted the Massachusetts Constitution of 17, which became a model for constitutions of many other states. And both of these homes, well, I guess during the pandemic, we probably will not be able to visit these homes, but normally they are open during the summer and early fall. And it's really only a few bucks to enter the home. The Stamp Act would motivate John's participation in the Sons of Liberty. But despite his commitment to growing revolution, John was also an unflinching believer in the basic rights for all, as demonstrated that he was the one who defended the commander of the British troops involved in the Boston Massacre. He later became a delegate to the Continental Congress and helped draft our Declaration of Independence. He actually was the man who negotiated the peace treaty with the British in 1783, and then had the good fortune to be our first ambassador to the country we had just beaten. Talk about taking one for the team. He was vice president to George Washington, a job he openly considered to be insignificant. And in 1796, in our country's first campaign, Adams and Tom Jefferson basically tied, and the election ended up in Congress, where an attempt to place Jefferson in office backfired, and Adams, a Federalist, became president, and Jefferson, a Republican, became his vice president. If you imagine Donald Trump as president and Hillary Clinton as vice president, you got a sense of why we needed the 12th Amendment. Now, at the time of John Adams' administration, public sentiment was for war with France, which was attacking our shipping and impressing our seamen. And some French officials had actually attempted a bribe of American diplomats in the famous XYZ affair. But Adams knew it was too soon for the young country to go to war. He negotiated a peace treaty, which only added to his growing unpopularity. And during these problems, Adams signed the pernicious Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it unlawful to write or speak anything that was false, scandalous, or malicious against the government, which, hashtag, that's what the internet is for. Anyway, this left a bad taste in the public's mind about Federalists in general and Adams in particular. And so in 1800, he lost our country's second real presidential election to Thomas Jefferson. But before he left, John Adams became the first president to live here in the White House. His wife Abigail used to hang laundry in one of the rooms during cold weather. At that time, there were only 150 employees of the U.S. federal government. On July 4th of 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, John Adams passed away. His last words were said to have been, "Thomas Jefferson lives." What he did not know was that his frequent political combatant had passed away earlier the same day. Now, I used to say at this point in my speech that John Adams lived to see what no man has since seen, a son in the White House. We'll talk about the New England connection that changed my speech later. John Quincy Adams had quite the boyhood. His acquaintances included Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and Thomas Jefferson. And by the time Quincy Adams was 12, he and his father had run the British blockade 4 times on their way to Paris. Washington, whom his father served as vice president, would appoint John Quincy to be minister to The Hague, and then his own father appointed him to be our country's first ambassador to Prussia. And James Madison, another contemporary of his father's, would appoint him to be our first ambassador to Russia. And while minister to Russia, he helped negotiate the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812. While in London, serving as our American consul, he met a young 20-year-old English-born woman whom he married. Returning home with tons of foreign policy experience, Adams would win a 4-way race for the presidency when Henry Clay threw his support and his electors towards Adams's way. When Adams turned around and made Clay Secretary of State, Andrew Jackson was furious. He called it a corrupt bargain and quit the Senate and would spend the next 4 years running for president again. For such a nimble and successful foreign diplomat, it's surprising how inept John Quincy was at domestic politics, which was becoming more and more toxic as sectional pressures between the North and South were growing. After his drubbing at the hands of his former rival, Andrew Jackson, in the 1828 election, Adams left few accomplishments other than his reducing the national debt from, get ready, $16 million down to $5 million. And so John Quincy Adams, like his father, would become the second president to serve only 1 term. I like to try to find amusing anecdotes where possible for every president I talk about. John Quincy Adams had a ritual of a pre-dawn swim in the Potomac, nude. Hearing this, a female reporter by the name of Anne Royal, wanting to get an exclusive interview, snuck up to the president's swimming hole, and while he was in the middle of the river, she sat down on his clothes, refusing to get up to let him dress until he granted her an interview. Now, in 1830, John Quincy Adams was asked by his Quincy neighbors if he would run for Congress. See how outdated this quote sounds. He replied, quote, "No person could be degraded by serving the people as a representative of Congress." Adams would become the first and only president to serve in the House of Representatives after leaving our nation's highest office. While in the House, he opposed the Mexican War, and he sponsored the establishment of the Smithsonian Institution. And it was there on the floor of the House of Representatives where he was fatally struck with paralysis, and he died later on February 23rd of 1848. Now let's look at the Adams home in more detail. This original section along the front was built in 1730 by a man named Leonard Vassall, who was a sugar planter from Jamaica. Not a period house. Period house is one in which the furnishings are of that era, because furniture and you'll see lots of bric-a-brac were added by John Quincy, Charles Francis Adams, and other members of this auspicious family as they returned from overseas duties. This is known as the Long Hall, and that exquisite wallpaper was brought back from Italy by John Adams during one of his many trips to the continent for our country. In this home lived several generations of the Adams family. Presidents John and his son John Quincy Adams, John Quincy's son Charles Francis Adams, who was a minister to Great Britain, a colonel in the Civil War, and a president of the Union and Pacific Railroad, John Quincy Adams, a political leader here in Massachusetts, Henry Adams, author of The Education, and Brooks Adams, the eminent writer and historian. Known as Peacefield, it is surrounded by a magnificent garden, and visitors, when they're allowed there, are encouraged to stroll the grounds. Inside this separate building is this library with all of John and John Quincy's books carefully indexed and sorted. I love this room. The tombs of John Adams and his wife Abigail, as well as John Quincy Adams and his wife Louisa, are here in the crypt of the United First Parish Church in downtown Quincy. It is the only edifice in the country that is the burial place of two presidents and their wives. And it normally is open during the summer months and the rest of the year by appointment only. So we won't turn your mics on, but I'll ask you to try to guess in your mind if you can tell me who our next New England-born president would be. This gentleman. And he is New Hampshire's only native son to reach the White House. This is Franklin Pierce, who was born in Hillsborough, New Hampshire in November of 1804. Franklin Pierce attended the Bowdoin School with Nathaniel Hawthorne and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, quite the graduating class. He first got involved in politics to help his father get elected governor. In 1829, he became a state legislator and later Speaker of the House. He then, in 1834, became a U.S. congressman, and after 2 terms in the House, was elected to the Senate. And then, in 1842, he retired from politics, returned to New Hampshire, and proceeded to turn down offers to be interim senator, sit in James Polk's cabinet, and be governor of New Hampshire. He did enlist to fight in the Mexican-American War, where he rose from a private to brigadier general in just a year. Franklin Pierce would serve with Ulysses S. Grant, Winfield Scott, Robert E. Lee, and Jefferson Davis while serving during this war. Franklin Pierce became America's second dark horse candidate when a deadlocked 1852 Democratic convention, desperate for a candidate who was as inoffensive to as many people as possible, chose Franklin Pierce. He had safely been out of politics and kept his mouth shut, so no one really knew what he thought. He never expected, nor did he want to win. In fact, in his inaugural address, he said, quote, "I have been born into a position so suitable to others rather than desirable to myself." He's what we historians call a doughface. That's a northerner with Southern slaveholding sympathies. He hated the abolitionists and saw nothing wrong with the expansion of slavery. In fact, Pierce wanted to add Cuba as a slaveholding state. Now, that never happened, of course, but he did approve the Gadsden Purchase from Mexico for $10 million. Now, when part of the Louisiana Territory splits into 2 territories, Kansas and Nebraska, each got to hold a territorial election. When Kansas held its election, thousands of pro-slavery Missourians crossed the border to help elect a pro-slavery legislature. When the Kansas governor tried to disqualify those illegally elected legislators, Pierce overrode him. And this led to an explosion of violence known as Bleeding Kansas. So by trying to expand the Union and maintain the fragile peace, he just managed to tick everybody off, Northerners and Southerners alike, and he failed to win his party's nomination for a second term. Once when asked what a president should do after leaving office, he replied, quote, "There is nothing left to do but get drunk." Pierce said he supported the Union cause, but he denounced Lincoln's administration as cruel and oppressive, and he called the Emancipation Proclamation unconstitutional. This is the Pierce Homestead, built by his father, Captain Benjamin Pierce, the year that his son was born in 1804. Benjamin has served with Washington in the Revolutionary War. When he arrived here in Hillsborough, he was practically impoverished. But in 20 years, he became a prominent statesman and public servant, and he became rich. In Franklin's home in 1842, there are pieces here, like this couch, that actually sat in the White House, as did this cabinet, which sits below a copy of Pierce's official White House portrait. The kitchen features hand-stenciled imported wallpaper restored to its original color. This is a period house. You will see furnishings there from the time that Franklin Pierce actually lived here, including this shaker bed. Notice the ropes that are strung crosswise, the length and width of the bed. Well, as you slept on this bed, there was a mattress on those ropes. The ropes would become loose. So you had a fork-like object you would stick in those, in that rope where it exited the frame, and you would twist the rope until it got tighter. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where we get the expression sleep tight. On the second floor of the Pierce Homestead was this ballroom, which was used not only for community dances and teas and other social occasions, but it was also where Captain Pierce would drill his regiment. Franklin Pierce died on October 8th of 1869 and was buried in Concord in what is called the Minot Enclosure. He was so reviled for his Southern and slaveholding sympathies that it wasn't until 1914 that a statue erected in his memory was put in front of the New Hampshire State House here in Concord. Okay, the next New England-born president is another gentleman whom we really hear about or think about. This is Chester Arthur, and he is one of two presidents born in one of the country's least populated states, Vermont. He's also, frankly, one of my favorite presidents. He was born in Fairfield, Vermont in 1830, and later he would be nominated for the vice presidency. There was a 19th century version of the birther controversy, which is frankly just as bogus as the one that hounded Mr. Obama. Although political enemies tried to prove otherwise, all evidence supported an American birth, although some of his rivals claimed that he was actually born in Canada, which of course would have disqualified him, according to the Constitution, for being a president. Chester Arthur taught penmanship at the same school where 3 years later, James Garfield would also teach. And given how these two men's lives would be thrust together later in life, that's a pretty neat coincidence, I think. Chester gained a reputation as a champion of civil rights for the blacks, and I'll bet none of you knew that. He was a lead attorney on a landmark decision called the Lemon Slave Case that allowed blacks coming to New York State to be set free. This began his rise to the presidency, which, until he was elected vice president, would be jobs that were all appointed. You see, our friend Chester A. Arthur was what today's newspaper columnists would call a hack, starting with his appointment as quartermaster of New York during the Civil War, and then his post-war job as collector of the Port of New York. It was the spoils system that caused a floor fight to break out at the Republican Convention in 1880 between the stalwarts, those supporting the existing system, and the reform wing of the party. They were known as the half-breeds. So a deal was struck, probably one of those great smoke-filled rooms. The half-breeds got their candidate, former Brigadier General of the Union Army, James Abram Garfield of Ohio. They nominated him for president. The stalwarts got Arthur, and everybody was happy, except for a guy named Charles Guiteau, a disturbed itinerant lawyer, writer, preacher, and politician who felt slighted when his efforts on behalf of Garfield's candidacy were not rewarded. And on July 2nd, 1881, just 200 days into his presidency, Garfield was shot by Guiteau, famously declaring, "I am a stalwart," and Arthur now president. 2.5 months later, after a series of botched efforts to save his life, James Garfield died. And now Arthur, shown here being sworn into office, is president. Well, the stalwarts they're not happy that Garfield is dead, but they think they got their man in office who would stop all this reform nonsense. And now comes the part of his life that makes Chester Arthur one of my favorite presidents, because the stalwarts were in for a shock. Arthur was deep down a reformer at heart. And over the remainder of what should have been Garfield's term of office, Arthur became a champion of civil service reform. He also investigated the tariff corruption, pursued corruption cases like the Star Route mail frauds, in which post office officials, contractors, and a former senator conspired to obtain congressional appointments for starting new and useless routes. Arthur also used surplus revenues, I don't know what those are. Anyway, he used them to lower taxes and bring down the national debt. And he also began the construction of 4 steel cruisers, which were the beginning of America's modern naval fleet. He is known as the father of the Steel Navy. Arthur also sought the construction of steam-powered steel cruisers, steel rams, and steel-clad gunboats like the USS Charleston, and under his watch, the Naval War College was founded. So with all this reform activity, it should come as no surprise that Arthur had no success securing the nomination for a second term, although we later learned that poor health dulled his enthusiasm for the job anyway. This was the election during which William Tecumseh Sherman, who was a favorite of many Republicans, uttered that famous Sherman pledge: "If drafted, I will not run; if nominated, I will not accept; and if elected, I will not serve." He didn't get the nod anyway. It went to a notorious stalwart named James Blaine, a pick so bad, it actually led to the election of the first Democratic president since before the Civil War. Chester Arthur's actual birthplace had fallen into disrepair, and by the 1900s, nothing was left but the foundation. And for many years, all there was to mark the site where he was born was a plain granite market. But in 1954, the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation reconstructed the house from an old photograph, and the home is filled with period furnishings and tells the story of his early days here in rural Vermont. Chester Arthur is buried here at the Albany Rural Cemetery in Menands, New York, his adopted state. Ladies and gentlemen, the next president is easy to guess. He's one of the classic New Englanders who made it to their highest office. He is, of course, Calvin Coolidge. I've been living in New England since 1980, which, according to local custom, makes my daughter a tourist. But I've come to love this part of the country, and it really is no surprise that another one of my favorite presidents I enjoy speaking about, often described as that classic New Englander, is Calvin Coolidge.
Hey, Dave.
Yes, sir.
Dave, before you get into Coolidge, I didn't catch this when we were practicing. We can hear 99% of what you say,
Yes.
but every once in a while you kind of tilt your head to your left, and usually towards the end of a sentence, and we lose what you say sometimes.
Okay.
Okay.
Then I will not do that.
Okay. Like me, you move around a lot when you talk.
Okay.
And so yeah, just do your best.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll keep that in mind, and I'll try to actually lean in. Now that I turned my video off, I'll lean in a bit closer to the mic so you should hear me better. This is the center of the Plymouth Notch Historic District in central Vermont. It is the birthplace and boyhood home of our nation's 29th president, Calvin Coolidge. It is virtually unchanged since the turn of the last century. That house on the left side of our screen was for 5 generations until 1876, the Coolidge family residence. beginning with Captain John Coolidge, who in 1789 was one of Plymouth Notch's first selectmen. This bedroom is located on the first floor and was, on July 4th, 1872, the birthplace of our only president to be born on the 4th of July, John Calvin Coolidge. The building has been extensively restored to look as it did back on his birth year, with original furnishings donated by the Coolidge family. I love that fact because I think it tells us a great deal about the Coolidge family that they had saved 100-plus-year-old furniture. This building attached to the Coolidge home is the Florence Siley General Store, which was built in the 1850s and run by the president's father, John. In 1917, he sold his share to Ms. Siley, who ran it until her death in 1945. Visitors to Plymouth Notch will even today find a working general store complete with penny candy, which unfortunately costs about 50 cents now. This is Coolidge Hall, on top of the general store, which was used by the local Grange and for weekly dances, much like the hall in Franklin Pierce's home. This became Coolidge's summer White House in 1924 and features an exhibit on how Coolidge's presidency affected the people of Plymouth Notch. When Calvin was 4, the family moved across the street to the Homestead, which his father purchased in 1876 for $375. John Coolidge added the front piazza and bay windows to a sitting room. Calvin lived here until 1887, the year he entered the Black Rover Academy here in nearby Ludlow. He then went to Amherst College. Afterwards, he studied and practiced law in Northampton, Massachusetts, and he likely spent much of his time here at the Northampton City Hall. He was once asked what his hobby was, and he replied, quote, holding office. And given his steady rise through the ranks, that was no joke. He started his public career as a city councilor here in Northampton, then became the city's solicitor, clerk of the courts, state legislator, mayor of Northampton, state senator, lieutenant governor, and finally, governor of Massachusetts in 1918. Just in time for the Boston police strike, in which tens of thousands of people flooded Boston streets as the policemen all went on strike due to a number of post-war grievances. When he saw the city in the shape that was in with all of these people riotings and lootings, he uttered the famous phrase, there is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, at any time. And he brought in the state militia, which brought the city of Boston back under control. That stand came just in time in this post-World War I Red Scare. Bolsheviks are hiding behind every tree America. He was a symbol Republicans could exploit. And they nominated him at the 1920 convention to be vice president with dark horse candidate Warren Harding. Coolidge was here in Plymouth Notch when early on the morning of August 3rd of 1923, word reached the homestead that the president, Warren Harding, had died. Now, there is no law requiring it, but Coolidge took the oath of office from his father, who was a notary public, in this room. It had been known as the sitting room up to that point, but from that moment on would always be known as the oath of office room. It contains the Bible and the kerosene lamp that were used on that historic night. Finishing up Harding's term, Coolidge rooted out much of the corruption that probably would have doomed Harding's chances for a second term anyway. And in 1924, the Republicans asked America to keep cool and keep coolly, which they did, electing him to the office of president in his own right. The business of America is business, Calvin Coolidge once said, and his administration was filled with business leaders who weakened the regulatory agencies set up by the Roosevelt, Wilson, and Taft administrations. Ironically, a great deal of the money saved from tax cuts for the wealthy went into the stock market, which was enjoying unprecedented growth during the 20s, but would soon collapse and take those savings with it. In 1928, Calvin Coolidge announced he would not run for a second term. What it took us 50 years to find out was that Calvin Coolidge had suffered a heart attack in 1927 and was advised not to run for health reasons. It's hard to imagine in these days, with every detail of our president's health, down to Jimmy Carter's hemorrhoids, that we didn't know that a president had suffered a heart attack, but we didn't. After leaving office, Coolidge and his wife, Grace, returned home to Northampton, but there's so much tourist activity, as evidenced here by the crowd who had shown up to welcome them home, that they moved to another, more secluded home. Both the Coolidge homes in Northampton are privately owned and no visiting is allowed. There is, however, a Calvin Coolidge Memorial Room here at the Forbes Library. Located there are family mementos, correspondence, photographs, and other materials relating to Coolidge's public career. Mr. Coolidge passed away in 1933 and was buried across Route 100A from his beloved homestead. It is as simple and unassuming as Coolidge himself. Calvin Coolidge was known for being a taciturn, tight-lipped individual. He was once given the name Silent Cal. Yet the truth is that he held more press conferences than any other president up to that time, and many more than those who would follow. His theory, though, was if you don't say anything, you can't be called upon to repeat it. One of my favorite stories about Calvin Coolidge. His successor in the governor's office here in Massachusetts was a man named Channing Cox. So one day, Coolidge is visiting his successor, Cox, and Cox said to Coolidge, "I don't understand it. You left your office every day at 5 p.m., and I have to stay here until late at night working. What was your secret?" Coolidge looked at Cox and said, "You talk back." Now, more than any other political family, perhaps none has been studied and dissected more than the one that gave us the 35th President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Here at 83 Beale Street in Brookline, Massachusetts, is the birthplace of John Kennedy, and a home bought by his father Joseph just before his marriage to Rose in 1914. It is owned and operated by the National Park Service and is open all year long. The basement of the home has been turned into an exhibit dealing with the entire Kennedy clan. John Kennedy was actually born in this room, the second of four sons, on May 29, 1917. We know that most births took place at home, and that midwives would use the room with the most light, in which this case was Rose and Joseph's bedroom. John was a sickly boy and spent a great deal of time in this bed, and yes, that is John Kennedy's teddy bear sitting over there on the rocking chair. When John was 4, the family moved to this home on Abbotsford Road, also in Brookline. They lived here until 1927 when Joe moved the family to New York. This home is privately owned and no visiting is allowed. John, a privileged young man, attended Canterbury, then Choate prep schools. He afterwards at Harvard read and was with honors graduated. Some of you might know that poem. Anyway, the graduating class of 1940 was star-studded, included John Kennedy, Jack Lemmon, Pete Seeger, Donald Regan, William Proxmire, Alan J. Lerner, and Harding Carter. With U.S. entry into World War II, John joined the Navy and was given the rank of ensign and command of the PT-109, a patrol boat that sunk near the Solomon Islands after being rammed by a Japanese destroyer. His older brother having been killed in the war, it fell on John to pursue his father's political plans. And in 1946, he ran for and won a seat in the House of Representatives. That seat, once held by James Michael Curley, would one day be occupied by his nephew Joseph. The 1952 senatorial campaign was political payback in a way, as John would beat Henry Cabot Lodge, whose father had beaten John's dad for the same seat back in 1916. And in 1960, after a grueling campaign in which his young age, he was only 42, and his Catholic religion had to be addressed, Kennedy won the Democratic nomination and then the right to face Republican Richard Nixon in the general election. As some of you might even remember, the campaign was noted for a series of televised debates with Richard Nixon that are credited with helping Kennedy win the election. His administration could not have started worse, however, as he approved a half-assed plan for the invasion of Cuba by the CIA, using Cuban exiles with generous help from the Central Intelligence Agency, known as the Bay of Pigs. The 61 coup attempt was a total disaster. And just 2 months later, in Vienna, Kennedy was scheduled to meet the Soviet dictator, Khrushchev. Now, despite the tension, Kennedy's wit was in full force. At the meeting, Kennedy is said to have asked the Soviet dictator what those medals on his chest were. And Khrushchev began ticking them off one by one, and he got to one he said was the Peace Medal. And Kennedy said, let's hope you get to keep that one. In August of 1961, the wall between East and West Berlin was built by the Soviets, further escalating tensions between the US and the Soviet Russians. At the height of the Cold War, as far as we know, came in 1962, when high-altitude photographs revealed the Soviets were installing nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles on the island of Cuba, just 90 miles from US shores. Kennedy played the game of nuclear brinksmanship, enforcing a naval blockade of Cuba, and after 10 days, Khrushchev blinked, removing the weapons. And he used his newfound prestige to get the nations of the world to sign a nuclear test ban treaty in August of '63. And as we know, barely 1,000 days into his presidency, he was killed on November 22nd, 1963, during an early campaign trip to Dallas, Texas. After much wrangling with the city of Cambridge, a library dedicated to John Kennedy was built instead here on Columbia Point in Boston. I.M. Pei's striking design employing a circle, a square, and a triangle make this one of the city's most distinctive buildings. Inside, you'll find a research library and a stunning glassed-in atrium that is used for meetings, debates, and special exhibits. Downstairs is a fantastic exhibit. If you haven't been, I can't recommend it enough. It takes you through the 1960 campaign, a walk down street in typical middle America, past the Kennedy campaign office. Then you get to sit and watch the inauguration of the nation's youngest elected president. And then this is so cool. They recreate parts of the White House, including the Oval Office, plus other exhibits that tell of JFK's vision for the space program, his war years, and his fight with the governors of several southern states over segregationist policies. The exhibit also features displays on Jackie Kennedy's days as our first lady. It also delves into some of the controversies that surrounded JFK as far back as 1946. One of my favorite lines by any comedian, Mort Saul, once famously said of John Kennedy that his father told him, "Don't buy one more vote than is necessary." And Kennedy supposedly really gave it back to Mort Saul for that. The Dream Lives On is the theme of the last part of this exhibit, in which visitors are treated to memorabilia about advances in the space program, civil rights, and relations with Russia. This chunk of the Berlin Wall stands as a tribute to Kennedy's resolve when Russia built the wall during his term of office. I highly recommend the JFK Library once things get back to normal. Okay, we're down to 2 more New England-born presidents. And our next one is this gentleman. Turns out, no matter who won the 1988 presidential race, Massachusetts would have sent its 4th native son to the White House. For both Democrat Mike Dukakis and Republican George Bush were born in Norfolk County, Massachusetts. Mr. Bush was born in this house in Milton on June 12, 1924, in a makeshift delivery room set up on the 2nd floor of this Queen Anne home, just like John Kennedy. When George was a year old, his family moved to Connecticut. Neither this home nor the one in Connecticut are open to the public. He served us heroically in World War II, his plane being shot down in the Pacific, and he barely evaded capture by the Japanese. He would attend Yale after the war, and turned out to be a pretty good first baseman, but not before he married the former Barbara Pierce in January 1945. After graduation, he entered the oil business in Texas, and in 1962 began his political career by being elected chairman of the Republican Party of Harris County, of which Houston is a part. After failing to win a Senate seat in 1964, he did win a seat in the House of Representatives, where he served 2 terms. He would lose another bid for the Senate in 1970, losing to Lloyd Bentsen. But then he was appointed by Richard Nixon to be our ambassador to the UN in 1972. And in 1973, at the beginning of the height of the Watergate scandal, Bush would take a job as the chairman of the Republican National Committee. Nixon's successor, Gerald Ford, would appoint Bush as the head of our liaison office in Peking. Communist Chinese capital was known back then. And then in 1975, he was brought back home to take the reins of the CIA. He first ran for the presidency in 1980, but lost the nomination to Ronald Reagan, who turned around and asked him to be his vice president. They won twice. And then in 1988, Mr. Bush would run again for the presidency, getting the nomination and running against, okay, let's move on. When George Bush won the presidency, it was the first time since 1837, when Martin Van Buren succeeded Andrew Jackson, that a vice president would succeed the president through the ballot box and not through the death of a sitting president. His term began with several domestic crises, including savings and loan scandal. Internationally, Mr. Bush ordered troops into Panama to secure the rightful president in office when Manuel Noriega refused to accept the results of his country's election. Both major communist powers presented unique challenges to Mr. Bush, even for a seasoned diplomat as he, as the Chinese suppressed a student revolt in Tiananmen Square, while a remarkable set of events led not only to the fall of the Berlin Wall, but to the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1990, when Iraqi President Saddam Hussein ordered his troops to occupy Kuwait, Bush ordered U.S. troops into the region, as well to ensure the continued flow of oil from the Gulf. Using his diplomatic skills to the test, he put together a multinational force, an easy task to get that group to support anything we support, and after a brief war, Iraq was expelled from Kuwait. So with a victory over tyranny and ratings in the polls at unprecedented levels, Bush looked like a sure winner for re-election in 1992. But a stubborn economy that Bush insisted would give way to recovery never did, and became the main issue between Bush and Democratic challenger Bill Clinton and Reform Party founder Ross "I'm all ears" Perot. A 1988 campaign speech in which he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes," come back to haunt him after he signed the 1990 budget, which included a tax increase. A few of the miscues, like this moment during one of the presidential debates when he was caught looking at his watch, and Mr. Bush would lose his re-election bid. But his lame duck presidency was anything but quiet, with him calling for airstrikes against a recalcitrant Iraq, and then sending U.S. troops into the starving nation of Somalia to ensure the flow of relief supplies during a mission called Operation Restore Hope. The president's summer home, which has 6 bedrooms and 6 bathrooms, is situated on 11 acres of land here on Walker's Point, a rocky peninsula off Kennebunkport's Ocean Avenue. It was the president's grandfather who had the home built in 1903. It is private, no visiting is allowed, although you can view the home from Ocean Avenue. Just don't stop your car to take pictures of it, as I did many years ago. The Secret Service kind of frowns on that. When George W. Bush won the presidency in the year 2000, he forced me to make several changes to my presentation. First of all, I had to add a new president to the show. Second, I could no longer say that John Adams was the only president to see his son also elected to the office. George W. was born in Connecticut in 1946, while his father was attending Yale. Yale must have been in his blood because George W. would also graduate from school in 1968, then attending and graduating from the Harvard Business School. Like his father, George W. went into the oil business, and then he became a partner in the group that bought the Texas Rangers with the intention of building a dome stadium down in Arlington. Mr. Bush later sold his interest in the team and the dome. Well, actually, it now finally happened, but 2 owners later. Mr. Bush won 2 terms as Texas governor, but did not complete his second term, opting to run for the presidency in 2000. It took a couple of months, but after a discrepancy over votes in the swing state of Florida wound up in the Supreme Court, Bush was declared the victor, took office in January of 2001. We are under attack. Those 4 words spoken by Chief of Staff Andy Card to the President on September 11th, 2001 would change America forever and challenge the new president in ways not matched since the dark days of Kennedy and the Cold War, Roosevelt and World War II, or Lincoln during the Civil War. He proceeded after the attack on us with the invasion of Afghanistan and the taking down of the Taliban, the invasion of Iraq to search for weapons of mass destruction, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, a new agency tasked with protecting the country, the opening of the prison at Guantanamo Bay, and the challenges of an economy battered by the effects of 9/11, leading to the crisis of 2008 and the signing of the first stimulus bill by Mr. Bush. We've all seen how the presidency ages men. Even Ronald Reagan started to turn gray. It's a wonder that anyone would want this job. But 45 men have taken it, 8 of whom call New England their home. All face great challenges, whether those of a new country or growing world power under attack. I think in some way we owe them all a debt of gratitude for being willing to serve the country as they did. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm going to, start my video again and say hello to everybody. And I guess I'll stop sharing my screen with pushing that button. There we go. So thank you all so much for joining us in this virtual presentation. This was fun. I've done a lot of these for work, but this is the first time I've done it for fun. So thank you.
You did a great job, David. So I'm going to stop the recording at this point.